Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and this is where I would normally say we are streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, but since we are having connectivity issues, the museums are closed today until we can get that fixed, and the live stream is not happening. So we'll record this, we'll post it later, but we won't be able to take any questions from the live stream today. If you've not already silenced your cell phones, please do that now. Don't forget that the exhibit Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley, Let the World See, has opened upstairs and will run through May 14th. Admission to the exhibit is included with your ticket to these museums, or free for History is Lunch attendees after the program. I think we probably have other announcements that I might make, but since I couldn't get my computer up and connected, this is what you're going to get today. I'm excited about our program, I'm excited about our speaker, and I'm excited to welcome Pamela D.C. Jr., who is the director of these museums, to come up and say a few words. For those of you who are on social media or just around, you may have seen an announcement recently that Pam has, despite the fact that she looks like she's in her mid-20s, actually got 30-plus years of service into the state and is retiring at the end of June. We're going to miss her. It's not going to be the same. Come up and say a few words about Daphne Chamberlain.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Chris. And while I do have the microphone, I want all the veterans that are here from the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement to stand up, please. Thank you so much. And let me just say this, because I may not get another opportunity to say this, but thank you. Because of you, I am here. So thank you so much. And now we're going to talk about Dr. Daphne Chamberlain. Dr. Daphne Chamberlain is Associate Professor of History and Vice President for Strategic Initiatives and Social Justice at Tougaloo College. She earned her BA in History from Tougaloo College, woo-woo, and her MA and PhD, and I graduated from Jackson State, but we have this wonderful woman from Tougaloo College. She earned her BA in History from Tougaloo College and her MA and PhD in History from the University of Mississippi. Before returning to Tougaloo, Chamberlain taught history and African American studies at the University of Mississippi and was founding director of the COFO Civil Rights Education Center at Jackson State University. She has served as a scholar consultant for numerous local and state and national civil rights projects, including the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Chamberlain is the immediate past president of the Mississippi Historical Society. And now, without further ado, Dr. Chamberlain.
Good afternoon. Oh, we can do much better than that. Good afternoon. This is an absolutely wonderful day to be here with you all for History is Lunch. And I would first like to take this opportunity to thank the Mississippi Department of Archives and History for this opportunity and always calling when needed, and also when I'm not needed, I always say yes. But I give special recognition to Pam D.C. Jr. She's the original storyteller, and has had a tremendous influence in my life over the past several years. And of course, she was a tremendous influence here at the two Mississippi museums, and her work here will truly be missed. However, we know she will still be a presence and a force to be reckoned with as we continue to tell the stories of Mississippi's history. But before I begin, let me say this. I'm going to return to my roots of academic reading. And I feel like this story is best told and most beautifully told by reading what has been written, as opposed to just talking through what happened in 1963. As we walk through this 60th commemoration of the Jackson Children's Crusade. And though the children I will be talking about in this presentation are of my mother's generation, I have long felt connected to the youth of the 1960s. Dr. Smith, as a student at Tougaloo College several years ago, a little over 20 years ago to be exact, I sat in a classroom and I read John Dittmer's Local People. And his attention to a 1963 high school walkout prompted me to question why more had not been written on children's activism in the civil rights movement. And even before my time at Tougaloo College, I remember the first time I learned about the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till. My family had just moved back to Mississippi, and I've shared this story several times, but I think the way in which it touched me is one that I have to share with an audience and also share with others. But my family moved back to Mississippi in the early 1990s to Columbus. And after my first day of school, I checked the mailbox. And I was so excited because little black kids, when you check the mailbox and see an edition of the Jet magazine, we always know to run straight to the top 20 albums and singles. And that's what I was doing, was getting ready to gear up to see if my music collection was on point with what was listed in that particular edition of the Jet magazine. However, as I was flipping through those pages, I came across one of the most disturbing and gruesome images that my fifth grade eyes could ever see. And that was the story of 14-year-old Emmett Lewis Till, who had been murdered in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. Now, at such a young age, I did not understand or even realize the profundity of what I had seen and what I had read. And of course, how the narrative of Emmett Till would stay with me forever. What I immediately identified with was that he was black like me. He was close in age with me. And he was killed in Mississippi, the place where I had been born, raised, and had returned to. And immediately I tried to make this case to my parents that we needed to move back to where we came from. And all of these years later, I realized too that I am a part of that Emmett Till generation. And that even in 2023, what happens to any of us in the world had better be the business of all of us. And those are the words of Emmett Lewis Till's mother, Mamie Till. Now, the murder of Emmett Till could have paralyzed young people with fear, but his murder actually served as a catalyst for their activism and laid the foundation for a crusade that would take place for another 10 years or so. And this particular presentation for today's History is Lunch will highlight the roles of young people as political actors and activists in Jackson, Mississippi during the struggle for civil rights. Now, my research started several years ago. As a matter of fact, I told you, as I sat in an undergraduate classroom at Tougaloo, I was questioning why more had not been written on children's participation in the movement. But once I got in graduate school and was tasked with the work of identifying a topic, it was natural that I reflect on that moment from reading Dr. Dittmer's book, Local People. And I completed my dissertation in 2009 entitled, "And a Child Shall Lead the Way." But it wasn't until recent years that more scholars have given attention to young people's activism, because it had prior to been previously marginalized, and there were about 3 of us across this country who were actually doing the work on children between the ages of 7 and 18, and how actively engaged they were on the ground in communities all across the American South. But my work in particular offered a narrative account of youth participation in Jackson while providing historical context for their activism. But before I get into all of that context, I do want to lay out the narrative for you. So before the Birmingham Children's Crusade of 1963, before the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in September of 1957, and even before the landmark Brown decision in May of 1954, Black youth here in the city of Jackson had already taken the initiative to challenge the system of Jim Crow. And in 1946, students at William Lanier High School led a bus boycott here in the city of Jackson. And this is one of the moments in which I defined as a precursor to the civil rights movement here in the city. And this event primarily remained in obscurity until people started coming out of the woodwork sharing their stories. And there's also a documentary that was produced by Dr. Wilma Clopton that highlights the role and importance of this bus boycott. But this particular event highlights youth leadership in the absence of a significant organizing tradition. And if you're familiar with the civil rights scholarship, Charles Payne's book, I've Got the Light of Freedom, talks in depth about an organizing tradition that had taken place here at the grassroots level across the state of Mississippi with people like T.R.M. Howard in the Mississippi Delta, like E.W. Steptoe and others in Southwest Mississippi. And of course, with folks like Medgar Wiley Evers here in the city of Jackson, who had been mentored by Dr. Howard. But this particular event that you see behind me, this particular local act of resistance to Jim Crow, illustrates the spirit of radicalism in Jackson that existed as early as the 1940s. And this 1946 bus boycott in Jackson, Mississippi, was one of the earliest post-World War II protests by Black children willing to confront segregation and discrimination in Mississippi. And one participant shared, quote, "We accomplished what we set out to do, so we know that Rosa Parks was not the first person to get up for white folks. Here in Jackson, Elport Chess had done it in 1946, and we never thought of it as a civil rights case." Janetta Jordan. So, of course, all of this is just simply walking us up to 1963 and provides context for the fact that young people were actively engaged. They were not silent. They were paying attention to the world in which they lived. And of course, these were young people who were leaders and also organizers in the local community. Now, once the 1950s hit, there was this real push by NAACP chapters to organize youth councils. And by the 1950s, there were 2 youth councils that existed here in the state of Mississippi, one in Laurel, Mississippi, and the other one here in the city of Jackson. But the NAACP first organized its youth councils during the 1930s to shape personal values of young people and to also encourage political involvement. And in Mississippi, the organization of youth councils predates the 1950s, yet those efforts to maintain their operation were at first unsuccessful. But in 1951, the Jackson branch of the NAACP announced plans to hold its organizational meeting of a youth group on September 30th at Pratt Memorial United Methodist Church. But it wasn't until 1956 when there was really a lot of interest that was being garnered around the young people in the community. And the Jackson branch of the NAACP was able to create the Youth Works Committee to organize a viable youth council. And by March of that year, the Jackson Youth Council was established. The summer of 1956 brought a lot of change to the life of one young man who you all see all the way to your right, and that is Amos Brown, who took his first trip out of the state of Mississippi to San Francisco when he joined Medgar Evers for the national convention of the NAACP. And when this young man returned to Jackson, he had a clear vision in mind. And in the fall of 1956 at College Hill Baptist Church, located near Jackson State University, Jackson NAACP Youth Works Committee installed Amos Brown, all the way to your right, Theodore C. Jones, Charles Hopkins, and George Ann Washington as officers of the newly established West Jackson Youth Council. And Amos Brown was named the first president. As president, 15-year-old Amos was responsible for getting his peers to focus on inequities and issues affecting Mississippi's educational system. So again, young people were paying attention to the world in which they were living, but of course they were also looking at the quality of education they were receiving, the lack of resources, secondhand textbooks, inequitable teacher pay, deplorable classroom environments, as well as deplorable schools. But it was near the end of the decade in 1958 where interest and participation in the Jackson Youth Council began to falter. And it was in a field report from Medgar Evers when he requested that all branches across the state of Mississippi, quote, organize a youth council in order that your leadership will not die. So it became critical for young people like these that you see behind me to be molded into the next and the new generation of leaders who will sustain the movement here in the city of Jackson, but also across the state of Mississippi. Now, Amos became a target of the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, and Medgar Evers was very supportive of young Amos, recognizing what appeared to be, quote, a well-planned program to intimidate members of our youth movement in Mississippi. Evers went on to comment, quote, one interesting thing about these acts of intimidation, instead of frightening the youth, they became more determined in their efforts than ever before. And as the 1950s came to a close, Amos Brown continued to be actively engaged in the freedom struggle, especially as Jackson embarked upon a full-scale civil rights movement. In 1959, he assumed the role as the advisor of the West Jackson Youth Council. And by the 1960s, Brown had been labeled by the State Sovereignty Commission as a, quote, full-fledged agitator, and was leading other young people in protest against the local power structure. Now, of course, you see all of these are images of Jackson's freedom fighters. And many of these are students who were enrolled at Lanier High School, Brinkley High School. These were students at Tougaloo College as well. And of course, the ages range from junior high all the way up to college. And they are reflected here in this beautiful space in the Civil Rights Museum. But of course, as we leave the 1950s, we're talking about Jackson, Mississippi becoming a hotbed for civil rights activities during the 1960s. And from 1960 to 1962, Jackson youth were active in challenging segregation across the capital city. And in the spring of 1960, Jackson's youth decided that the time had come to take action against the long-standing system of Jim Crow. Downtown businesses became the center of economic boycotts, particularly during the holiday season. Jackson's African-American youths had been making concerted efforts to challenge segregation in the capital city. And many of them agreed that they had been marginalized by the city government because there was simply nowhere for them to go for recreation. So keep that in mind as I go through some of the next few images, that there was nowhere for them to go for recreation. And during the summer of 1961, they made attempts to integrate public accommodations where white youth were able to enjoy themselves. And inspired by their children, African-American parents were becoming more vocal because it was not just their community, but their children who were facing discrimination at the Jackson Zoo. They were facing discrimination at Jackson Parks and other recreational facilities. In October, as October has been for several years now, October of 1960, even before this 1961 handbill, became the prime season for young people to target the segregated Mississippi State Fair. Now, realizing the inequality demonstrated in this major annual event, members of the Student Committee for Human Dignity proposed a boycott of the Mississippi State Fair, which was supported by approximately 5,000 students saying, quote, we believe no Negro person who believes in human dignity and democracy will participate in or attend the Mississippi State Fair for Negroes this year. And in turn, the Jackson branch of the NAACP issued a statement endorsing the young people's actions, saying that, quote, all people who believe in human dignity will support these students in this fight against discrimination and bigotry. And this is an image from 1961 of young people who are students at Tougaloo College, Campbell College, which no longer exists, and also high school students who were boycotting the state fair. And let me tell you that this boycott was so effective. Initially, there were some challenges that the young people faced in 1960, but it was so effective from 1961 and 1962 that the Jim Crow had completely been dismantled by 1963. And that was all at the efforts of these young folks. And this particular image here also gives you an idea of how young people were paying attention, and they were also politically motivated in how they articulated the concerns of their day and focusing on the state fair. This is a political cartoon from the Voice of the Jackson movement. And what it reads is, "You can't boycott the Negro State Fair." And of course, it's the use of dogs, police dogs. And this is all captured in October of '62 in this publication. And as a result, these young people are jailed for their participation in this boycott of the state fair. And it asks, is this Southern hospitality? So young people are using a rhetoric of the time against the power structure, but also calling attention to the unfair and inequitable spaces that they don't have access to and are unable to occupy during this time period. But really important to play up not just the fair, but also the zoo, the parks, and other facilities where children should have access and be able to enjoy freely. But it's those places of recreation that became targets for them. Now, in 1961, the NAACP Youth Council was able to reorganize its two chapters. So, of course, the West Jackson Youth Council continued, but Colia Liddell, who was by this time a freshman at Tougaloo College, and also the special assistant to Medgar Evers, organized interested young people to form the North Jackson Youth Council in Jackson's Burton edition. And after garnering enough youth support, Colia approached her sociology professor about becoming the advisor to the North Jackson Youth Council. And she was appointed the president of the youth group, and Professor John Salter Jr. agreed to serve as advisor, and his service to the youth group thrust him into the Jackson movement. Now, during Colia Liddell's tenure as the president of the North Jackson Youth Council, the council's involvement in the community increased, and so did its membership. The youth group made its presence known by reaching out to Jackson's Black community. The youth council had its own newspaper entitled the North Jackson Action. The North Jackson Youth Council, which was comprised of mostly high school students, developed into a committed group of young people, enthusiastic community organizers as young as 9 years of age, who wanted to bring about change. And the children began by first taking on small projects such as encouraging African Americans in Jackson to vote and also apply for respectable jobs, especially at white-owned establishments. Now, by 1963, the movement began to gain intensity, not just here in the city of Jackson, but 1963 was a volatile year for civil rights activities throughout the South. And this was also a period of time in which high schools had become breeding grounds for youth activism. Now, Gene Young, who you see here behind me, who many of you may be familiar with and even had the opportunity to know, was affectionately known as Jughead. And he was a seventh grader at Lanier Junior and Senior High School in 1963. And as a 12-year-old, Gene Young was familiar with what was taking place around him in the city and where he had grown up. His mother was actively involved in the NAACP. But in early May, he was more focused on the promise of summer and the prospect of playing Little League baseball. But Young recalled that his older brothers, James and John, informed him that there would be a walkout at Lanier and stipulated that he better participate. Now, what he had to remind his brothers of was that he was scheduled to be in his PE class and that the walkout was to occur at that particular time, and he was extremely scared of Mr. George Edwards, who was also known by students as Big Time. And they said he was one of the meanest teachers at Lanier High School. However, I think Gene Young understood that his brothers could be even meaner at home. So he yielded to their threats, and he participated by leaving out of the school at noon on March 30th. And he joined several other students on the school lawn. Now, 12-year-old Gene Young, whose name is commonly associated with the Jackson Youth Movement, was among the many activists arrested and jailed at the state fairgrounds that I just made reference to. He soon became a well-recognized young face at the mass meetings that were held at the Lynch Street Masonic Temple. And after being released from jail, Young was asked to speak at a mass meeting to encourage others to support and even join the Jackson movement. So he stood on a chair behind a podium, as you see here, as Medgar Evers and celebrity activists such as Dick Gregory and Lena Horne listened attentively to the powerful message delivered by a child. And in the days that followed, more people joined the movement and more activity ensued. On May 31st, the day after, Jackson police, with the assistance of 60 armed members of the Mississippi Highway Patrol, lined Fair Street in case the events of the planned demonstration escalated beyond control. And as local and state law enforcement officials prepared to put a halt to the demonstration, 327 Jackson youths prepared to march from Fair Street Baptist Church to Capitol Street. And downtown Jackson had become the stage for many civil rights demonstrations, marches, and sit-ins over the course of 4 days. And of course, if I go back a few days prior, if you recall, May 28th of 1963 is when you had students from Tougaloo College, as well as John Salter, the sociology professor, who were a part of a sit-in at the downtown Woolworths. So all of this just was one event that was compounded with other events that happened here in the city. And over those 4 days, students between the ages of 7 and 18 assembled at Fair Street Baptist Church, and they were mostly from Lanier, Brinkley, and Jim Hill High Schools. But it was between May 28th and June 5th that 1,048 arrests were made in connection with civil rights activities in the city. And Mayor Allen Thompson sought to put an end to the Jackson movement. And what he asserted was that these demonstrations had placed an undue burden and strain upon the manpower of the police department of the city of Jackson and their efforts to provide for the safety of all citizens. Even Hinds County Judge J.C. Stennett granted the city's request, issuing an injunction to put a stop to any further civil rights demonstrations in Jackson, but this only led to more protest activities. Now, even after the assassination of Medgar Evers in June of 1963, it was the voice of an 8-year-old girl on Fair Street in front of Collins Funeral Home singing "Oh Freedom" that gave new life to the movement. So this shows the power of young people and, of course, the bravery of young people to sustain a movement even in this time of grief, in this time of tragedy. Now, the city of Jackson was changing, and it was the youth who were leading the movement in new directions. Coley Liddell proclaimed that the 1960s was the era of student-led movements during the civil rights struggle. She remembered when a new Mississippi newspaper printed an editorial cartoon in which young people were marching and leading the movement, as Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders ran to try to get ahead. In one of the earliest conversations I had with Hollis Watkins, who this presentation is dedicated to, he said that the general sentiment of young people was this. They were telling the older generation or the older guard of leaders, step aside so we don't have to step over you. Now, Gene Young, whose image you just saw, had many speaking engagements, even at the age of 12, 13, 14 years of age. And he continued his activism even as a student at Jackson State College during the 1970 shootings. But young Gene was telling people about his experiences in the Jackson movement and how important it was that they support the larger civil rights movement. And this is an image of young people who are boarding a bus to go to the March on Washington in August of 1963. And Gene Young was one of those young people who participated. And he sat next to Ann Moody, and Ann Moody, the author of Coming of Age in Mississippi. And in her book, in the final pages of Coming of Age, Ann Moody talks about how energetic, excited Gene Young was to be going to Washington, D.C., because he said, we're going to go up to Washington and we're going to tell them something at those COFO hearings. We're going to tell them what Mississippi is all about. Moody, we're going to get some things straight here in Washington, huh? And she was quiet But in the background, people were singing, "We Shall Overcome." And she remained quiet as Jean Young, with all of that energy, finally realized what may have been going on in her mind. And as people were singing, "We Shall Overcome," she was asking at the end of the book, will we in Mississippi overcome? And of course, both of them were wondering. Now, while the nation had its eyes on this new phenomenon of child activism in Birmingham in May of 1963, and of course, by September of 1963, that's when we see the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The precedent for youth activism and involvement in the civil rights movement had already been set here in Jackson, Mississippi. And that's one of the things that I tried to impress upon my readers in the manuscript itself when I wrote my dissertation, is that Birmingham was not the beginning of youth activism. James Bevel's ability to be able to recruit young people in 1961 here in Jackson, Mississippi, became the model for his ability to recruit young people in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. So the precedent had already been set. But of course, the 1963 campaign here in the city of Jackson was a continuation of a tradition. And young people like Shirley Harrington in this image here, who at the age of 13 became involved in the Jackson Nonviolent Movement by being involved in the Medgar Evers NAACP Youth Council. These were the young people who were able to sustain the freedom fight beyond 1963. Now, time has passed, and youths, they are no more. But the people you see in the room who stood earlier, but also those you see in these images, were key actors and contributors to the Jackson movement. And these were young people who facilitated change, not just here in the city of Jackson, not just in other areas of Mississippi, and not just across the state or the South. They facilitated change in this country. And some of them are in this very room today. So I'm going to ask them in particular, as we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the Jackson Children's Crusade, if the children of the Jackson movement will please stand so that we may salute you. And there are others. I always get these impromptu history lessons, and I received a text message this morning from Fonzie Brown Wright. So I'm always sitting at her feet and others' feet listening, and she was telling me about the Madison County NAACP Youth Council and how these young people started the Vernon Damer Choir, Freedom Singers, and how she was involved and inspiration and influence for these young people. So thank you for the history lessons that you're always sharing with me. But we also have children of the movement. So Miss Charlene and Miss Cynthia Palmer, if you all would please stand. Now, I mentioned in closing that, of course, this presentation was dedicated to Mr. Hollis Watkins. Over the years, I have had the opportunity to engage with an amazing group of people who have become more like family to me. And of course, over the course of the research that was done prior to the dissertation, but also as I got further into the dissertation, and even now, as I try to convert my dissertation into a book manuscript, many of the people who were so important to this work have passed. And I did want to take this time to pause and remember them. And because from Colia Clark, who recently passed, of course, I mentioned her as the president of the North Jackson Youth Council, first president. She was instrumental in my 1950s and 1960s chapter. Charles Durr was who introduced me to the 1946 bus boycott. And that right there is an interesting story all itself on how I was able to pull together that particular narrative. But I even had an opportunity on regular occasions to sit with Amy Logan at her home as she was cooking greens in her kitchen, but just listening to her and talking about the active role of young people in the movement. But there are even people listed here who I did not have the opportunity to interview, but yet and still they encouraged me to keep going with the research itself. And last but not least, one of the people who really encouraged me was my mother, who said, just get the book done. So Charles Holmes, Dr. Charles Holmes, I'm going to ask you to stay in my ear too so I can get the book done. But before we open it up to questions, because I do believe in participation, and also I do believe in lifting up the voice of Hollis Watkins, even in his absence from this space today, Miss Cynthia Palmer has graciously agreed to lead us in one freedom song, and that is Get On Board, Children, Children, Get On Board, Children, Children, Get On Board, Children, Children, to fight for equal rights. Miss Cynthia Palmer. And if you can stand, please feel free to join in, and I'm going to lip sync, so y'all don't hear me sing. I'm going to stay here. Everybody knows that song? Yeah. You know, get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children. What's the next part? Let's fight for human rights. Get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children. Let's fight for human rights. Get on board, children, children, get on board, get on board. Get on board. Get on board. Get on board. Let's fight for human rights. Get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children. Let's fight for human rights. Get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children, get on board, children, children. Let's fight for human rights. Now, Cynthia Palmer is my right and my left hand at Tougaloo, and my right and left foot. So let's please give her another round of applause. And in this last few moments, I did want to open up the floor for questions. And of course, remember that we are blessed and fortunate to have some of these children of the movement in the room today. So I invite you to ask questions of them. And if not in the larger space, perhaps even after today's History is Lunch session.
Dr. Chamberlain's wonderful presentation, and you answered one of my questions about would there be a book coming out soon. And I just deeply regret not inviting Dr. Louis Liddell, who was Dr. Collier's brother, who was a part of the children movement, and hopefully that will be a History of Lunch in the future. And also, my heart is filled with a dear colleague, a mentor, Dr. Gene Young. I wasn't a student in his class, but if you were around Dr. Young, he would throw some knowledge on you, and he loved his fraternity. So and my heart is just full, and he was just a dear mentor, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
And Dr. Young was actually the first person I interviewed. When I called him, he agreed immediately to jump in. And Louis Liddell, I was able to interview him. And what's amazing about the research itself is the relationships that were built over time, but then also understanding with the 1946 bus boycott, my grandmother's caregiver was L. Port Chest's wife, and I did not have an idea. Dr. Theodore Jones, who was one of the officers for the West Jackson Youth Council. That was my orthodontist, and I did not know until later on that he was active in the Jackson movement. But all of these things, and it's just, I consider it divine providence, how all of this has come together and how people continue to be interested in the story, because it is an important story.
I have to agree that it was a really great presentation. As someone who's pretty young, we get often criticized for not being wherewithal or politically invested in our community, and to hear and see that kids young as 9 and 15 were really engaged, it's inspiring. And it kind of makes me realize that I can play a huge part in my community. It doesn't have to always be aggressive or assertive. There are things to like take part in. So this was just refreshing, and it feels nice to be seen. So thank you for sharing that history with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain, for such a fantastic presentation. That young lady preempted my question, because I was going to say that that's the story that young people should see, should know, should hear. And she's representative of the response that I would hope that the story would elicit it. So I really don't have a question. She did it. Thank you, lady. And that's fantastic.
Dr. Smith, what's really important about that, just to both of your point, is that young people see themselves in the history, because they often don't understand what role they can play.
Right.
And Reverend Harrington beautifully shares her story with Tougaloo College students through one of the courses, our English courses at the institution. So, yeah, seeing themselves in her story, in her narrative, grown at 13, has really transformed the way in which our students think about what they can do in their local communities, but also to change the state of Mississippi.
Fantastic.
Thank you for inviting me, and I suppose I should stand. In 1965, I became, and I don't think we've talked about this, I became the youth president of North Jackson Youth Council, and I should increase your history volume with that knowledge. And Flonzie already know, because she has this wonderful picture of me on her wall. In 1966, I was one of the persons who helped to organize the Vernon Damon Choir, and then helped to organize a choir in Yazoo City as part of our youth council work, because I was traveling with Charles Evers. My father charged me to him. I was the youth president moving around the state with him, and when he was organizing adults, I was organizing young people. And to the young lady, let me just say, you made me feel real good, because in 2020, when the pandemic was going on, and also the riots with the young people, I was sitting questioning God, what else could I do? And he said, you need to tell your story. And see, I haven't been in Mississippi except for 5 years now. I was in Washington, D.C. for 25 years. So some of what you see, I'm not in it. But Jean and I used to laugh all the time, because Jean would be put on the stage as the male spokesperson for youth, and then they would put me on the chair as the female spokesperson. And I used to tell him, Jean, see how discrimination is? They took your picture and put it in the magazine, and they never put my picture in the magazine. But we as young people in North Jackson and West Jackson, in my little book, Grown at 13, I talk about how we struggled to get along across town as young people with our own differences. And that's what people have not accepted, is that black folks have differences too, and how we work together, how we think about things, how we accept those which were called the outsiders, the young people who came from around the country. It was tons of them. And we had to struggle with that too. And I talked about how young people reasoned with other young people. So the book is sort of, I call it a little boilerplate to youth activism. And I also talk about anger and fear and rejection in the book, which I have been totally surprised at how the children have responded to it, because they tell me they are angry. And I'm telling them, this is a way for you to do something with that anger, because you cannot let anger take you over.
I won't be long, but Jimmy Travis, a person that was very, very quiet and so wonderful. Can you just expound on him just a little bit for people that don't know who he is?
So Jimmy Travis is one of the people I did not have an opportunity to interview. And when he passed, that was one of the things I regretted. But one of the things he did know was that I was doing the research, and he said, "Young lady, keep on doing the work." But Mr. Travis was a student at Holy Ghost High School, and that is a school that a lot of people don't really know about, with young people who are actively involved in the movement. And that is where, I think in the dissertation, I said he was baptized in the movement, is those early moments of 1963. But Mr. Travis was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, and primarily worked in the Mississippi Delta. This is somebody who traveled widely with Bob Moses, and also was shot just outside of Greenwood, traveling back, became the target of a lot of racial violence during the 1960s. But he is, just like Bob Moses, a quiet, gentle giant, very reserved, full of wisdom and knowledge, but always willing to share his story, like so many of the people who I have had the amazing opportunity to get to know over the years with this project. But yeah, I miss Mr. Travis, and one of the things that I'm really excited about, the veterans were able to name a lecture series for Mr. Travis, because he served as the executive director of the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. So very, very special, and of course, I'm glad that you saw the name up there, but also remember him, and we can remember him in this space.
First of all, I would just like to thank you. I'm originally from Laura, and I was not a member of the Youth Council, Dr. Murphy Youth Council, because I was just too young at that time, but I was familiar with some of the people that you named. So I want to thank you for this, because I think this is important information. But my first question, I have two questions. One is, I am curious that Mr. Amos Brown, is he related to Ben Brown, the guy that they killed in '68 down on the corner of Lynch Street and Rose Street?
Now that's a great question, and I have never asked Reverend Brown if they were related. When Reverend Brown graduated from high school, he ended up going on to Morehouse College, and of course coming back and forth and participating in a lot of the activity, but also getting involved in Atlanta. But with the murder of Ben Brown, I have never even thought to put that connection together, but I will have to ask him. I will have to ask.
Okay. My second question was, in your research, did you have any research about the 11 students that first integrated Provine at that time and their participation?
Now, I stopped by the time we got to the integration of Provine, but I do talk about integration because when we think about all these different moments historically about young people being involved in the movement, there are a lot of moments when young people were involved in the movement. 1955, even before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin. And then there were young people in Tallahassee, Florida, who were part of a bus boycott. So there are a lot of moments where we see young people on the ground doing work. But I did not talk in detail about the Provine integration or desegregation, but I am extremely familiar with it.
Great.
Sure.
You're saying 11. What year are you talking about? Do you know? 66. I'm a 66, 67 graduate of Provine High School. I was the first black to graduate in a summer program because I was a year ahead, and I graduated in the summer of 1967. That year, 66, 67, there were 5 of us at Provine, and 3 of us graduated.
Melba Sue Chambliss.
Chambliss was the year before. Yeah, Chambliss was the year before, and there were only 2 of them the year before. Because when they started voluntary desegregation, my mother was over voluntary desegregation for Jackson Public Schools, and that's a part of the archives I've donated to Tougaloo College. They asked for 12th grade only, where the first desegregation was voluntary, was 1st grade and 12th grade. And then the next year they added in 11th grade and 2nd grade and 7th grade. And with the 7th grade year, which would have been my 11th grade year, I also was identified as a senior. My sister desegregated Hardy Junior High by herself. And that's in my book about her, my mom dropping her at that junior high school with 1,000 kids and then dropping me over at Provine. But she wanted to keep us together since we were these activist kids. But Provine is one of those schools that has a lot of history that we need to just about tell a story on Provine.
Exactly. And even in the 1950s, Medgar Evers threatened to desegregate Provine after Jim Hill would not allow Amos Brown to enroll after a scathing interview that he gave in Cleveland, Ohio. So that is a lot of history right there with just Provine High School. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Initially, after that interview, they did not want him to enroll because they said he would be a bad influence on his peers. But when Medgar Evers threatened to desegregate in Provine, they changed their mind and allowed him to enroll.
Yes, you mentioned Holy Ghost High School, of course, with Holy Ghost Catholic Church. Even getting Holy Ghost Catholic Church for African Americans started required a lot of work. German priests and nuns came to start that, mainly the priests of the Divine Word Mission Order, and they had to hide the priest coming from Canton. He made it as far as Canton. To bring him into Jackson safely, some railroad workers had to hide him under lumber to bring him down here. And years later, of course, I attend St. Peter's Catholic Church on Sundays, and for a long time there was a gentleman who graduated from the Holy Ghost. He was there at the same time as it was St. Joe. And we were talking about when in 1969, after the Alexander versus Holmes County case, Father Gilbert, who was in charge of Catholic education in Mississippi, wanted to do the same thing, bus so many here and so many there. And he said, we didn't want to go to school with y'all. We had German. Y'all had French. And that's why so many of us are scientists today.
Thank you.
So thank you for this presentation. The commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the Jackson Children's Crusade coincides with today across the world, the 60th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising against the Nazis in Poland. And the connection between the African American community and the Jewish community has been a strong one over the decades. And you talked about so many outsiders were coming in, and a significant proportion of those were Jewish teenagers. So it's important history. It's a good thing we're not in Florida today, because we couldn't have done this. And the whole idea of trying to repress teaching the past so we can learn from it, I'm hoping that Mississippi will not jump into that abyss again of darkness, of not wanting to know about how we got where we are today and what are we going to do to change the future for all of our children of whatever color any of us are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just really want to thank you, Dr. Chamberlain, for such an informative hour. Many of the things that you taught us, some you taught us, some were refreshing. with regard to Dr. Brown, he is still as active today with a stroke than he was earlier. I had an opportunity to speak at his church for Women's Day some few years ago. And I mean, he jumps right up out of the pulpit keeps on walking. And I had a chance to meet Gene Young as well. The gentleman in the back mentioned Father Gilbert from Canton. Okay, I attended Holy Child Jesus when they opened up in the late 50s, so I knew him quite well. In every little town, I think it's safe to say that in every little town, there was probably a contingent of young people doing things, didn't realize that they were perhaps making history at the time. But I'm so glad that you highlighted those the various youth chapters within the Mississippi, the Jackson area in particular. And I'm honored to say that I'm sitting beside Medgar Evers' niece, Charles Evers' daughter. Would you stand again, baby? Okay. So again, great job. And we need more information and more history lessons like you have taught us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation today. It's been wonderful. I'm a mom of 2 elementary-aged boys, and I'm sitting here hearing these stories about the Children's Crusade and thinking about things from the perspective of the mothers of those children. And Dr. Chamberlain, I wonder if you delved into that at all with any of your subjects you interviewed, or if any of the veterans of the Children's Crusade can speak to what their parents were going through in terms of, fighting their fear for the well-being and safety of their children, but also, wanting to encourage their children's advocacy and that sort of thing.
In one interview in particular, Frankie Adams Johnson, who's also a member of the Veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement, talked about her mother. They were members of Cade Chapel, lived in the Verdant Addition community here in Jackson. But of course, our mother worked as a domestic. And of course, there's always the concern about, safety, concern about having to succumb to economic pressure, losing jobs because of your children's participation in the movement or your participation in the movement. But Ms. Johnson, in her reflection of that time that she was involved in the movement, especially in 1963 and 1964, she said her mother was extremely supportive, even though there was always this constant threat looming that she could possibly lose her job. I'm a mother of 2. I always ask myself, would I have allowed my children to get involved? But it was a no-brainer because I would have been involved. But I think one of the most powerful stories I've ever heard, it has been shared by someone sitting in this room who just got finished talking. Ms. Wright, would you mind sharing with us, just because of your involvement in the movement there in Canton, what you would do to make sure that Ms. Palmer and your sons were okay? Because I think that even hearing that story of a mother's love and a mother trying to make sure that her children were protected in that moment.
Wow, okay. Being involved in Canton, and some of you may know that I am the first African-American female to be elected to a public office in the state of Mississippi in 1968 in a biracial town, many years ago. Thank you. Thank you. And being involved in the movement brought to my family many threats. My father, me, shot at, been to jail. Ku Klux Klan would sit in front of my home when I would go to work for the NAACP. They would push cards under my NAACP office door, the eyes of the Klan are upon you, things of that nature. But the most poignant moment in my life, I was attending Tougaloo College as a non-traditional student at that time. And I would get phone calls all the time, we're gonna kill you, Ian. And one night I got a call, we're gonna kill your children. If you don't get out of this movement, we are going to kill your children. And I was a mother of 3, Cynthia, Ed, who's deceased, and my young son, Lloyd. And what I would do every day without them knowing it. I would take my lunch hour from my job or at Tougaloo, and when they would get out of school in the afternoon, I would follow them home on another street to be sure that they got home safely. And I went to the sheriff, and I told him that if anybody harmed my children, you need to send some, now don't y'all try this, but you need to send some body bags. Because you know that mother thing that rises up in you when you're trying to protect your children? But I would follow them home on another street while they walk home with their friends to be sure that they got home safely. And I never told them that until 2 years before my son passed away 9 years ago. Because I didn't want them to be fearful. I didn't want them to, every time they saw a white person on a truck, to be afraid. Or I want them to be as normal as they could. But I was prepared to defend them because they didn't ask for what I was doing. That was my choice. So I never told Cynthia, Edward, or Daryl until 10 years ago. And they're all grown now. They're older than me, they say.
We have come to the top of another hour, but we have an announcement that I had forgotten about. May I ask?
Wonderful presentation, and it's always a subject that is appropriate, it's historical, it's futuristic, because issues between people, no matter what color they are, they never seem to disappear, and I don't understand why we can't just accept each other the way we are. We're all people. We want to live. We want to raise a family. We want to be involved in a community. And I just always hate what we see in today's world. Also, I have two announcements. I'm on the board of New Stage Theater, and tomorrow at 10:30, they're doing a presentation here called Anne and Emmett. And it's a really powerful play with Anne Frank, who was discriminated against because she was Jewish, and Emmett Till, who was discriminated against because he was black. They were both 14 when they died, and it is really one of the most compelling plays. It only lasts a little over an hour, but I highly encourage y'all to come tomorrow to see it. Also, New Stage has just started the play Fences by August Wilson. It is a magnificent production. Dr. Mark Henderson, who's the head of the theater department at Jackson State, stars in it. He's incredible, but every person in this play is just amazing. So please buy your tickets to see Fences at New Stage, and please come tomorrow at 10:30. I think you will be very surprised to see this play and how important it is. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for being here today. One announcement that I forgot was to remind everyone to come back next week for History is Lunch. Devery Anderson will be with us to talk about his new book, A Slow Calculated Lynching. It's the first biography of Clyde Kennard. So come back for that. For now, help me thank Dr. Daphne Chamberlain for this fabulous program.